Hello everyone, and welcome back to a topic that might make you want to wear a tinfoil hat, but trust me, this is all very real. Today we're diving into some of the most shocking and unethical experiments conducted by the US government on its own citizens, often without their knowledge or consent. Now, you might be thinking that sounds like a conspiracy theory cooked up after one too many Red Bulls and a Wikipedia deep dive. And you know what? I wouldn't blame you. But the truth, as they say, is often far stranger and far more horrifying than fiction. We're talking about a level of betrayal that would make even the shadiest used car salesman blush. Over the years, in the name of science, national security, or maybe just plain old morbid curiosity, the US government has engaged in some truly messed up experiments. We're talking about injecting people with plutonium, dosing unsuspecting citizens with LSD, and intentionally infecting vulnerable populations with deadly diseases. And the worst part? This isn't some ancient history we're talking about. Some of these atrocities happened within our lifetimes. Let's start with a real gut punch, shall we? The Tuskegee syphilis study. For 40 years, from 1932 to 1972, the U.S. Public Health Service told 600 black men in rural Alabama they were being treated for bad blood. Now, bad blood was a catch-all term back then, used for everything from anemia to syphilis. But here's the kicker. These men had syphilis, and the government knew it. They weren't given treatment. They weren't given penicillin when it became readily available. They were given placebos, aspirin, and even lied to, told they were receiving special treatment. All to study the natural progression of this devastating disease. The result? Needless suffering, preventable deaths, and the disease spreading to wives and children. This wasn't just bad science, it was a racist and morally bankrupt experiment that left a stain on American history. The CIA, an organization that needs no introduction when it comes to questionable activities. And Project MKUltra? Well, that's one for the conspiracy theory bingo card. Imagine this, the 1950s, Cold War paranoia is at an all-time high, and the CIA is convinced that the Soviets have cracked the code of mind control. Naturally, their solution is to start their own mind-bending program. MKUltra involved everything from hypnosis to electroshock therapy, but their drug of choice, LSD, they slipped it into the drinks of unsuspecting citizens, dosed their own employees, and even used prostitutes to lure unsuspecting Johns into drug-fueled experiments. The goal? To see if they could control minds, create super spies, or even get people to spill state secrets. It was a chaotic mess of unethical experiments that ultimately achieved very little, except maybe inspiring a few bad trips and a whole lot of distrust in the government. From the 1970s to the early 1980s, during the horrors of apartheid in South Africa, something truly sinister was happening under the guise of science and national security. The Aversion Project, a program sanctioned by the South African military, sought to eradicate homosexuality from its ranks. Their methods? Let's just say they were more akin to torture than treatment. We're talking about chemical castration, forced hormone therapy, and even barbaric electric shock therapy where soldiers were shown homoerotic images and then subjected to painful shocks in an attempt to condition them to associate homosexuality with pain. Many of these victims were young, conscripted soldiers forced into this horrific program against their will. The physical and psychological scars left behind were devastating, a testament to the cruelty inflicted in the name of prejudice. The name itself sends chills down your spine, the Monster Study. Conducted in 1939 at the University of Iowa, this experiment targeted one of the most vulnerable populations imaginable: orphaned children. Now, stuttering, while often a source of insecurity, is not a disease. But these researchers, convinced they could induce fluency by sheer force of negative reinforcement, decided to test their theory on 22 unsuspecting orphans. Half of the children, labeled normal speakers, were showered with praise and positive reinforcement. The other half, labeled stutterers, regardless of their actual speech patterns, were subjected to constant belittlement, ridicule, and criticism of their speech. The results were devastating and predictable. The children subjected to this psychological abuse developed anxiety, speech difficulties, and lifelong emotional scars. This experiment is a horrifying reminder of how easily good intentions can be twisted into something monstrous when vulnerable populations are treated like lab rats. Okay folks, buckle up because this one is a doozy, even for the CIA. Picture this. San Francisco in the 1950s, the heart of the Beat Generation, a time of cultural upheaval and experimentation. The CIA, always keen to stay ahead of the curve, decided to conduct their own social experiment, using, you guessed it, LSD. They called it Operation Midnight Climax. Catchy, right? Here's how it worked. The CIA set up safe houses disguised as brothels. They hired prostitutes to lure unsuspecting men, slip them LSD, and then observe. They watched through two-way mirrors, recording their every move, their every hallucination, their every paranoid breakdown. It was a twisted, voyeuristic experiment that exploited both the men who were drugged and the women forced to participate. The whole thing was a colossal ethical disaster, even by Cold War standards. The Tuskegee syphilis study was bad enough, but what if I told you the US government did something similar in Guatemala? Yep, that's right. From 1946 to 1948, US researchers, with the cooperation of the Guatemalan government, decided to use vulnerable Guatemalans as guinea pigs in their quest to understand syphilis. They deliberately infected soldiers, prisoners, and even mental patients with the disease, often without their knowledge or consent. They used prostitutes to spread the infection, injected men with syphilis bacteria, and even went so far as to swab the bacteria onto abrasions on their genitals. And the worst part? Many of these people never received treatment. They were simply observed, their suffering documented in the name of science. It's a shameful chapter in American medical history, a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power, and the dehumanizing consequences of viewing marginalized communities as disposable. From 1956 to 1970, at the Willowbrook State School, a New York institution for children with intellectual disabilities, a truly horrific experiment unfolded. Researchers, wanting to study the progression of hepatitis, decided that deliberately infecting vulnerable children was a good idea. They injected children with the virus, sometimes even feeding them extracts of feces from infected individuals. Parents, desperate to get their children into an overcrowded and underfunded system, were often pressured into consenting to these experiments, often unaware of the risks involved. The children of Willowbrook, already facing immense challenges, were treated like lab rats, their health sacrificed in the name of research that could have been conducted ethically. In the 1950s and 60s, the US was obsessed with the threat of communism and the potential for biological warfare, so naturally they decided to conduct their own bioweapon tests on their own citizens. Between 1950 and 1969, the US Navy conducted a series of experiments where they sprayed massive amounts of bacteria, including E. coli and Serratia marcescens, over the San Francisco Bay Area. Now they claimed these bacteria were harmless, but they were wrong. People got sick, some even died. And the worst part? The residents of San Francisco had no idea they were being used as test subjects in their own city. It's a chilling example of how easily national security concerns can be used to justify putting entire populations at risk. From the 1950s to the 1970s, Holmesburg Prison in Philadelphia was home to a series of unethical medical experiments that preyed on a particularly vulnerable population: prisoners. Under the direction of a dermatologist named Albert Kligman, prisoners were subjected to a battery of tests, many of them painful, dangerous, and utterly unnecessary. We're talking about exposing them to dioxin, a highly toxic component of Agent Orange, testing radioactive isotopes on their skin, and even injecting them with mind-altering drugs. These prisoners were often coerced into participating, offered paltry sums of money or the promise of early release in exchange for putting their health at risk. And finally, we come to a particularly egregious example of scientific misconduct: the Fernald School radioactive oatmeal experiments. From 1946 to 1953, at the Fernald State School in Massachusetts, another institution for children with intellectual disabilities, researchers decided to study how the body absorbed iron and calcium. Sounds innocent enough, right? Well, their method was anything but. They fed these children, many of whom had developmental disabilities, oatmeal laced with radioactive isotopes. They told the parents it was part of a science club, a way to make the children feel special. In reality, these children were being used as human guinea pigs, exposed to potentially harmful levels of radiation without their knowledge or consent. It's a stark reminder of how easily vulnerable populations can be exploited in the name of scientific progress. These 10 cases, as disturbing as they are, represent just the tip of the iceberg. For decades, the U.S. government conducted unethical experiments on its own citizens, often targeting the most vulnerable among us. These weren't isolated incidents. They were systemic abuses of power, fueled by a dangerous combination of arrogance, secrecy, and a disregard for human dignity. These experiments serve as a grim reminder of the importance of ethics in research and the need for informed consent. We can't erase the past, but we can learn from it. We have a responsibility to demand transparency from our government, to hold those in power accountable, and to ensure that these atrocities are never repeated. Stay informed, ask questions, and never be afraid to challenge authority. The price of silence is simply too high.